In the humid bayous of Ascension Parish, Louisiana, 1847 marked the beginning of one of the most disturbing chapters in American plantation history. Colonel Nathaniel Beauregard, a decorated war veteran turned sugar plantation owner, initiated a systematic breeding program that would forever stain his family legacy. Decades later, when archaeologists discovered unmarked graves and encrypted ledgers buried beneath the ruins of Beauregard Manor, the horrifying truth emerged. The colonel had forced his own daughters into reproduction with enslaved men, believing he could create a superior bloodline for his plantation workforce. This is the story of how power, isolation, and twisted ideology transformed a respected family into perpetrators of unthinkable crimes, and how their victims' descendants fought for over a century to bring these buried secrets to light. Chapter 1. The Discovery. 178 years ago, in an isolated sugar plantation deep in the Louisiana bayou, military records and parish documents mentioned a case so disturbing that it was deliberately erased from official history. Colonel Nathaniel Beauregard and his family vanished from public records after 1847, but not from the whispered memories of the enslaved community. Their absence left scars that marked generations with a trauma so profound that descendants carried the weight of unspoken horror well into the 21st century. Before we continue, subscribe and hit the bell icon. Here we unearth secrets buried by official history and give voice to what was silenced. The Beauregard plantation stretched across 3,000 acres of fertile Louisiana soil, where sugarcane grew tall enough to hide terrible secrets. Colonel Nathaniel Beauregard had returned from the Mexican-American War in 1846 as a decorated hero, carrying with him ideas that would transform his plantation into something far more sinister than anyone could imagine. His neighbors knew him as a respected planter, a man of education and military bearing who commanded both fear and admiration throughout Ascension Parish. In March 2023, Dr. Sarah Chen, a forensic archaeologist from Tulane University, received an unusual call from construction workers renovating the old Beauregard property, now owned by a historic preservation society. They had discovered something beneath the collapsed remains of the main house, human bones, dozens of them, arranged in what appeared to be family clusters. But these weren't ordinary burial sites. The positioning suggested these people had been buried in haste, without ceremony, and without the careful attention typically given to plantation cemeteries. What made the discovery even more disturbing were the artifacts found alongside the remains. Leather-bound ledgers, their pages brittle with age and moisture, contained entries written in a code that would take months to decipher. Iron shackles, smaller than those typically used on adult slaves, suggested children had been restrained. Most chilling of all were the personal items: a woman's locket containing a child's hair, a man's wedding ring engraved with initials that didn't match any known plantation records, and dozens of small wooden crosses carved with symbols that didn't appear in any known religious tradition. Dr. Chen had spent her career excavating plantation sites across the South, but she had never encountered anything quite like this. The bones told a story of systematic violence, malnutrition, and premature death. Carbon dating confirmed that most of the remains dated to the period between 1847 and 1852, exactly the years when the Beauregard family had mysteriously disappeared from all public records. The ledgers, once decoded, would reveal a breeding program so methodical and cruel that it challenged everything historians thought they knew about the depths of plantation brutality. Local historians had always wondered about the Beauregard plantation. Unlike other major sugar estates in the region, it had left behind no proud family histories, no preserved records of prosperity, no descendants who claimed the family name with pride. The property had changed hands multiple times after the Civil War, with each owner eventually abandoning it after reporting strange occurrences, voices in the night, unexplained sounds from the old slave quarters, and a pervasive sense of unease that seemed to emanate from the very soil. The enslaved community had preserved their own memories, passed down through generations in whispered stories and coded songs. Elderly residents of the area, descendants of the plantation's enslaved population, spoke of ancestors who had warned them never to walk alone near the old Beauregard ruins. They told stories of women who had disappeared into the big house and were never seen again, of children born with features that marked them as different, of a master who kept his own daughters locked away from the world for reasons no one dared speak aloud. As Dr. Chen and her team began their methodical excavation, they realized they were uncovering more than just archaeological evidence. They were exhuming a deliberately buried chapter of American history, one that powerful people had worked very hard to erase. The Beauregard case would challenge everything the public thought they knew about plantation life, revealing that even in a system already built on unthinkable cruelty, there were depths of horror that few had dared to imagine. Chapter 2. The Colonel's Return. Colonel Nathaniel Beauregard returned to Louisiana in December 1846 as a changed man. His service in the Mexican-American War had exposed him to ideas about racial science and human breeding that were gaining popularity among certain intellectual circles in the antebellum South. At 38 years old, the colonel possessed a fortune built on sugar cultivation, a military reputation that commanded respect, and a growing obsession with what he called biological optimization of his plantation's workforce. The Beauregard estate had been in the family for 3 generations, established by the colonel's grandfather, a French Creole planter who had built his wealth on the backs of enslaved Africans brought through the New Orleans slave markets. By 1847, the plantation housed over 200 enslaved people, making it one of the larger operations in Ascension Parish. The main house, an imposing Greek Revival mansion surrounded by ancient oak trees draped in Spanish moss, stood as a monument to the family's prosperity and social standing. What set Colonel Beauregard apart from his neighbors was his systematic approach to plantation management and his disturbing interest in what would later be recognized as eugenics. During his military service, he had encountered officers and scientists who promoted theories about racial mixing and selective breeding, ideas that he began to implement upon his return to Louisiana. Unlike other planters who viewed their enslaved workforce primarily as economic assets, Beauregard saw them as subjects for experimentation. The colonel's personal life added another layer of complexity to his twisted ideology. He was the father of 4 daughters: Margaret, aged 19, Catherine, 17, Elizabeth, 15, and young Anne, just 13. Their mother had died in childbirth with Anne, leaving the colonel to raise his daughters in isolation on the plantation. He had never remarried, claiming that he was too devoted to his agricultural experiments to consider another wife. What the community didn't know was that his experiments would eventually include his own children. Beauregard's military connections had introduced him to the writings of Josiah Nott and other racial theorists who promoted ideas about human breeding and racial hierarchy. The colonel became convinced that by carefully controlling reproduction among his enslaved population, he could create what he termed a superior working class that would be both physically stronger and more intellectually capable than ordinary slaves. His detailed journals, discovered in 2023, reveal a mind obsessed with measurements, bloodlines, and genetic outcomes. The transformation of the Beauregard plantation began subtly. The colonel installed new quarters for what he called his breeding stock, separate from the general slave population. He began keeping meticulous records of physical characteristics, family histories, and reproductive patterns among his enslaved people. Visitors to the plantation noticed that Beauregard seemed unusually interested in the personal lives of his slaves, asking detailed questions about their relationships and children that went far beyond normal plantation management. Local society initially viewed the colonel's methods as simply the eccentricities of a successful planter. Plantation owners throughout Louisiana were experimenting with new agricultural techniques and management strategies, and Beauregard's attention to detail was seen as progressive rather than disturbing. His daughters were praised for their beauty and accomplishments, though neighbors noted that they rarely appeared in public and seemed unusually sheltered even by the standards of well-bred plantation daughters. The colonel's correspondence with other planters during this period reveals his growing confidence in his breeding theories. He wrote extensively about the need for scientific agriculture and the importance of improving the stock through careful selection. What his neighbors didn't realize was that his experiments were moving beyond the enslaved population and beginning to include his own family in ways that would horrify future generations. By late 1847, the Beauregard plantation had become a closed world, with the colonel controlling every aspect of life for both enslaved and free inhabitants. His daughters had been withdrawn from local social activities, and visitors were no longer welcome without specific invitations. The isolation that would enable his most horrific crimes was now complete, and the systematic destruction of human dignity was about to begin in earnest. Chapter 3. The Perfect Bloodline Theory. In the spring of 1847, Colonel Beauregard began implementing what he called his perfect bloodline theory, a pseudo-scientific ideology that would transform his plantation into a laboratory of human suffering. Drawing from the racial theories popular among certain Southern intellectuals, the colonel believed he could create a superior race of enslaved workers by combining what he perceived as the physical strength of African men with the intelligence and beauty of white women. His twisted logic convinced him that his own daughters, as representatives of pure white bloodlines, would be essential components in this breeding experiment. The colonel's journals, decoded by historians in 2024, reveal the systematic nature of his planning. He had selected 12 enslaved men based on physical characteristics he deemed superior: height, muscle development, and what he termed mental acuity. These men, ranging in age from 18 to 25, were separated from the general plantation population and housed in special quarters near the main house. They were given better food, lighter work assignments, and privileges that other enslaved people were denied, though they had no idea they were being prepared for forced participation in their master's breeding program. The colonel's daughters had been raised in virtual isolation, educated by private tutors, and rarely allowed to interact with anyone outside their immediate family. Margaret, Catherine, Elizabeth, and Anne had grown into beautiful young women, but their father's control over their lives was absolute. They were forbidden from corresponding with potential suitors, denied permission to visit neighboring plantations, and kept ignorant of their father's true intentions until it was too late to resist. Beauregard's methodology was chillingly systematic. He maintained detailed records of menstrual cycles, documented physical characteristics of both his daughters and the selected enslaved men, and calculated optimal timing for what he euphemistically called genetic combinations. His correspondence with like-minded individuals reveals a network of planters who shared similar beliefs about human breeding, though none appeared to have implemented programs as extreme as Beauregard's. The implementation of the breeding program began with Margaret, the eldest daughter, in August 1847. The colonel had chosen Samuel, a 22-year-old enslaved man from Virginia, as her first breeding partner. The details recorded in Beauregard's journals are too disturbing to recount fully, but they make clear that neither Margaret nor Samuel had any choice in what happened to them. The colonel treated the encounter as a scientific experiment, recording duration, physical responses, and his predictions about potential offspring. What made the situation even more horrific was the colonel's ability to convince himself that he was conducting important research for the benefit of plantation society. His writings show no awareness of the human cost of his experiments, only satisfaction when his predictions about genetic outcomes proved correct. He viewed his daughters not as beloved children, but as valuable breeding stock, and the enslaved men not as human beings, but as tools for his scientific advancement. Now, I invite you to leave in the comments where you're watching from and the exact time you're hearing this story. I want to know how far these silenced accounts reach. The community of enslaved people on the Beauregard plantation lived in terror of being selected for the breeding program, but they had no power to resist or escape. The colonel had increased security around the plantation, hiring additional overseers and installing locked gates that prevented unauthorized movement. Anyone who attempted to flee or resist faced brutal punishment, and the colonel made it clear that cooperation with his program was not optional. As 1847 progressed into 1848, the colonel expanded his program to include his second daughter, Catherine. The systematic nature of the abuse became routine, with scheduled encounters recorded in plantation ledgers alongside entries about crop yields and livestock breeding. The colonel's casual documentation of human suffering reveals a mind so twisted by ideology and power that it had lost all connection to basic human empathy. The physical and psychological trauma inflicted on both the colonel's daughters and the enslaved men selected for his program was devastating. Medical records found among the archaeological evidence suggest that several participants died from injuries or illnesses related to the forced encounters, while others suffered lasting physical and emotional damage that would affect their descendants for generations to come. Chapter 4. The Secret Quarters. Behind the main house at Beauregard Plantation, hidden by a grove of ancient cypress trees, Colonel Beauregard constructed what he called the breeding quarters in the winter of 1847. These buildings, designed to facilitate his twisted experiments, were unlike anything found on neighboring plantations. The structures combined the appearance of comfortable guest cabins with the functionality of prison cells, equipped with locks, bars on windows, and soundproofing that would muffle any cries for help. The quarters consisted of 6 separate buildings, each containing 2 rooms connected by a central parlor. The colonel had spared no expense in furnishing these spaces, installing fine furniture, silk curtains, and even imported carpets. To casual observers, they might have appeared to be luxurious accommodations for visiting dignitaries. In reality, they were carefully designed environments where the colonel could control every aspect of his breeding program while maintaining the pretense of civility. Dr. Chen's archaeological team discovered the remains of these quarters in 2023, finding evidence that confirmed the most disturbing aspects of survivor testimonies. The buildings had been deliberately demolished sometime in the 1850s, but their foundations revealed a complex system of hidden rooms, underground tunnels, and reinforced chambers that could only have served the most sinister purposes. Iron rings embedded in walls, restraining devices hidden beneath floorboards, and medical instruments buried in the ruins painted a picture of systematic abuse disguised as scientific research. The colonel's selection process for occupants of the breeding quarters followed his twisted interpretation of genetic science. His daughters were housed in the eastern buildings, each given their own quarters furnished with the finest amenities the colonel could provide. He convinced them that their participation in his program was essential for the future of the plantation and the advancement of Southern civilization. The young women, isolated from outside influence and completely dependent on their father, had no choice but to submit to his demands. The enslaved men chosen for the breeding program were housed in the Western buildings, where their accommodations, while better than those of field hands, served primarily as holding areas between forced encounters. The colonel maintained detailed schedules, documented in ledgers that survived the plantation's destruction, showing when each man would be paired with each daughter and for what duration. These records, decoded by historians, reveal the methodical nature of the abuse and the colonel's obsession with controlling every aspect of human reproduction. Survivors' accounts, preserved in oral histories collected by the Federal Writers' Project in the 1930s, describe the quarters as places of constant fear and suffering. Elderly former slaves who had lived on neighboring plantations remembered hearing screams and crying from the Beauregard property, sounds that carried across the bayou on still nights. They spoke of women who emerged from the quarters changed forever, and men who never spoke of what happened to them during their time in the colonel's special buildings. The colonel employed a system of rewards and punishments to maintain control over the breeding quarters. Cooperation brought improved food, lighter work assignments, and promises of eventual freedom that were never fulfilled. Resistance resulted in brutal punishment, solitary confinement, or worse. Several of the men selected for the program died under suspicious circumstances, their deaths recorded in plantation ledgers as accidents or illnesses, though evidence suggests they were murdered when they refused to participate or attempted to escape. The psychological manipulation employed by the colonel was as cruel as the physical abuse. He convinced his daughters that they were participating in important scientific research that would benefit humanity, while simultaneously threatening them with abandonment or violence if they refused to cooperate. The enslaved men were told that their participation might earn freedom for their families, a lie that kept them compliant even as their own humanity was systematically destroyed. Medical evidence discovered at the site suggests that the colonel also conducted primitive medical experiments on the inhabitants of the breeding quarters. Surgical instruments, bottles that once contained various chemicals, and human remains showing signs of medical intervention indicate that his twisted research extended beyond reproduction into areas of physical experimentation that would have been considered barbaric, even by the standards of his time. The quarters operated for approximately 5 years, from 1847 to 1852, during which time they became the site of countless crimes against humanity. The colonel's meticulous record-keeping documented the birth of 17 children from his breeding program, though archaeological evidence suggests that many more pregnancies occurred that were not brought to term, either through miscarriage, infanticide, or other means that the colonel chose not to record in his official ledgers. Chapter 5. The Children of Shame. The offspring of Colonel Beauregard's breeding program became living evidence of his crimes, children born into a world where their very existence represented the intersection of sexual violence, racial ideology, and paternal manipulation. Between 1848 and 1852, 17 children were born in the secret quarters, each one documented in the colonel's ledgers with the same clinical detachment he applied to livestock breeding records. Margaret Beauregard gave birth to 5 children during this period, each fathered by a different enslaved man, according to her father's systematic rotation schedule. The colonel recorded detailed observations about each child's physical characteristics, noting skin color, hair texture, facial features, and what he interpreted as signs of intelligence or physical capability. These children, born of rape and raised in captivity, represented the colonel's attempt to create his perfect bloodline, while simultaneously destroying the lives of everyone involved in his twisted experiment. Catherine, Elizabeth, and Anne each bore children as well, with the younger girls forced into the breeding program as soon as their father deemed them physically mature enough to participate. The trauma inflicted on these young women, who ranged in age from 13 to 19 during the program's operation, was compounded by their isolation from any support system and their complete dependence on their abuser for survival. The fate of these mixed-race children became one of the most disturbing aspects of the Colonel's program. Unlike the usual practice on plantations, where enslaved women's children would join the general slave population, Beauregard kept these children separate, housing them in special nurseries where he could continue his observations and experiments. His journals reveal plans to eventually breed these children with each other or with selected slaves to create what he called second-generation improvements. DNA analysis conducted on remains found at the site has confirmed the genetic relationships documented in the Colonel's ledgers, providing scientific evidence of the breeding program's extent. Dr. Maria Santos, a geneticist working with Dr. Chen's archaeological team, discovered that several of the children shared the same fathers, while others showed genetic markers indicating they were products of the systematic racial mixing that Beauregard had orchestrated. The children's daily lives were carefully controlled by the Colonel, who treated them as ongoing experiments rather than human beings. They were given better food and housing than typical slave children, but were constantly subjected to measurements, tests and examinations designed to document their development according to their father's racial theories. None of the children received formal education, as the Colonel feared that literacy might enable them to understand and resist their situation. Oral histories, preserved by descendants of the plantation's enslaved community, describe the children as living in a state of constant confusion about their identity and place in the plantation hierarchy. They were neither fully enslaved nor free, neither accepted by the white family nor integrated into the slave community. This liminal status created psychological trauma that would affect not only the children themselves, but their descendants for generations to come. The Colonel's plans for these children extended far beyond their childhood years. His correspondence with other planters reveals his intention to use them as the foundation for a new class of enslaved workers who would combine what he saw as the best qualities of both races. He viewed them not as his grandchildren, but as valuable property that represented the success of his scientific methodology. Several of the children died during infancy or early childhood, victims of the inadequate medical care and psychological trauma that characterized life in the breeding quarters. The Colonel recorded these deaths with the same clinical detachment he applied to all aspects of his program, noting possible causes and how the losses might affect his long-term breeding goals. The discovery of children's remains during the 2023 excavation provided heartbreaking evidence of their suffering. Small skeletons showing signs of malnutrition, evidence of physical abuse, and burial patterns suggesting they were interred without ceremony or recognition of their humanity painted a picture of lives that were brief, painful, and ultimately expendable in service to their grandfather's twisted ideology. As these children grew older, some began to understand the true nature of their situation and the crimes that had brought them into existence. Survivor accounts suggest that several of the older children attempted to escape or resist their grandfather's control, leading to increased security measures and more severe punishment for anyone who challenged the Colonel's authority over his human laboratory. Chapter 6. The Community of Silence. The horrors occurring at Beauregard Plantation did not happen in complete isolation. The neighboring planter community, local officials, and even some members of the broader Louisiana society were aware that something unusual was happening on the Colonel's estate. Yet a conspiracy of silence protected his crimes for years. This collective complicity represented one of the most damning aspects of the entire affair, revealing how systems of power and privilege could enable even the most horrific abuses to continue unchecked. Dr. Beauregard maintained correspondence with several prominent Louisiana planters who shared his interest in what they called agricultural science and stock improvement. Letters discovered in various archives across the state show that at least 6 other plantation owners were aware of the Colonel's breeding experiments and expressed interest in implementing similar programs on their own estates. None of these men ever reported the crimes or attempted to intervene on behalf of the victims. The local parish authorities, including the sheriff, tax collector, and justice of the peace, all had reasons to visit the Beauregard plantation on official business during the years when the breeding program was active. Records show that several officials commented on the unusual security measures at the plantation and the absence of the colonel's daughters from community social events, yet none investigated further or questioned the situation officially. The Catholic Church, which played a central role in Louisiana plantation society, also failed to protect the victims, despite clear signs that something was wrong. Father Michel Rousseau, the parish priest who served the local planter community, noted in his personal journal that the Beauregard daughters had not attended Mass or received communion for over 2 years. When he requested to visit the plantation to check on their spiritual welfare, the colonel refused his requests with increasingly hostile responses. If this story has already captured your attention, please leave a like. It helps the story of the Beauregard family reach more people. The enslaved community on neighboring plantations was well aware of the horrors occurring at Beauregard's estate, as information traveled through the networks that connected slaves across parish lines. However, their knowledge only increased their own terror as they feared being sold or loaned to the colonel's operation. Several documented escape attempts from nearby plantations were motivated by rumors that the escapees were going to be transferred to Beauregard. Local physicians who were occasionally called to treat plantation injuries or illnesses also witnessed evidence of the colonel's crimes. Dr. Antoine Thibodeau, whose medical records were preserved in his family's papers, noted treating several enslaved men for injuries consistent with violent assault, as well as young women suffering from what he euphemistically described as nervous exhaustion. Despite his medical oath and moral obligations, Dr. Thibodeau never reported these cases to authorities. The economic interests that bound the planter community together created powerful incentives to ignore or cover up scandals that might damage the reputation of plantation society. The colonel's wealth and social standing made him an important figure in local politics and commerce, and his neighbors feared that exposing his crimes might bring unwanted attention from northern abolitionists or federal authorities. Even the colonel's business associates in New Orleans, who handled the marketing of his sugar crops and provided financial services, noticed irregularities in his plantation operations. Banking records show unusual expenditures for construction projects, medical supplies, and security measures that exceeded typical plantation needs. Yet these financial professionals, concerned primarily with their profitable relationship with a successful planter, chose not to investigate the reasons behind these unusual expenses. The silence was maintained through a combination of self-interest, fear, and the deeply ingrained belief among white Louisianans that plantation owners had absolute authority over their property, including enslaved people. The legal system that existed to protect property rights provided no meaningful protection for the victims of the colonel's crimes, as enslaved people had no legal standing to report abuse and white witnesses chose not to intervene. This community-wide conspiracy of silence enabled the colonel's crimes to continue for 5 years and ensured that when the plantation was finally abandoned, the evidence of what had occurred would remain buried for over a century and a half. The complicity of so many individuals and institutions in enabling these horrors reflects the systemic nature of slavery's cruelties and the ways in which entire communities could become accomplices to unspeakable crimes. Chapter 7. The Disappearance. In March 1852, the Beauregard plantation fell silent. Neighbors who had grown accustomed to the sounds of agricultural activity, the grinding of sugar cane, the voices of enslaved workers, the routine comings and goings of plantation life, noticed that an eerie quiet had settled over the estate. When the parish tax assessor arrived for his annual visit in April, he found the plantation completely abandoned, with no sign of the colonel, his daughters, the enslaved population, or any indication of where nearly 300 people had gone. The circumstances surrounding the plantation's abandonment remained mysterious for decades. The colonel's financial records, examined by creditors and legal authorities, showed no indication of financial distress that might have forced a sudden departure. His crops had been successful, his debts were manageable, and he had recently made substantial improvements to the plantation infrastructure. The sudden disappearance of such a large and apparently prosperous operation baffled local authorities and sparked rumors that persisted for generations. Initial investigations by parish officials uncovered evidence of hasty departure, but no signs of violence or struggle that might indicate external attack. Personal belongings remained in the main house, including valuable items that would normally have been taken during a planned relocation. The breeding quarters had been deliberately demolished, their contents burned, and the foundations covered with earth in what appeared to be a systematic attempt to erase evidence of their existence. The fate of the enslaved population became the subject of intense speculation among neighboring planters, who were concerned about the potential for a slave revolt or escape that might affect their own security. However, searches of the surrounding swamps and forests found no evidence of large groups of fugitives, and no neighboring plantations reported unusual arrivals or attempted slave sales. It was as if nearly 200 enslaved people had simply vanished into the Louisiana bayou. Oral histories preserved in the African American community provided the first clues about what had actually occurred during the plantation's final days. Elderly former slaves, interviewed decades later, spoke of strange activities in the weeks before the disappearance, the sounds of digging at night, the smell of smoke that lasted for days, and the absence of the usual plantation routines. Several witnesses described seeing wagons loaded with covered cargo leaving the plantation under cover of darkness. The colonel's correspondence, discovered in archives during the 1990s, revealed that he had been in communication with contacts in Mexico and the Caribbean about potential relocation opportunities. Letters dating from late 1851 and early 1852 discussed the possibility of moving his agricultural operation to regions where he might have more freedom to pursue his breeding experiments without interference from changing political attitudes towards slavery. Evidence uncovered during the 2023 archaeological excavation provided the first concrete answers about the plantation's final days. Mass burial sites discovered on the property contained the remains of dozens of individuals who had died during the same time period, suggesting that the colonel's departure was preceded by a systematic elimination of witnesses to his crimes. The burial patterns and evidence of violence indicated that these deaths were not the result of disease or accident, but deliberate murder. The archaeological evidence suggests that the colonel implemented a final, horrific solution to his problem of maintaining secrecy about his breeding program. Rather than risk exposure by relocating witnesses who could testify about his crimes, he chose to eliminate them entirely. The remains of men, women, and children found in the mass graves showed evidence of execution-style killings, with many victims bearing injuries consistent with gunshot wounds or blunt force trauma. DNA analysis of the remains confirmed the relationship between many of the victims and the children born during the breeding program, indicating that the colonel had murdered not only the enslaved men who had been forced to participate in his experiments, but also many of the children who were the products of those encounters. This final act of violence represented the ultimate expression of his view of human beings as expendable resources in service to his twisted ideology. The few survivors who escaped the massacre carried their trauma into exile, eventually settling in communities throughout Louisiana, Texas, and Mexico, where they could disappear into populations of mixed-race individuals. Their reluctance to speak about their experiences, combined with the general social pressure to forget uncomfortable truths about slavery, ensured that the full extent of the Colonel's crimes would remain hidden for over a century. The Colonel himself, along with his surviving daughters and a small number of trusted associates, disappeared completely from historical records after 1852. Despite extensive searches by creditors, legal authorities, and later historians, no trace was ever found of their ultimate destination or fate, leaving the Beauregard plantation as a monument to crimes that had been literally buried but never truly forgotten. Chapter 8. Voices from the Grave. The 2023 archaeological excavation at the former Beauregard plantation became more than a scientific investigation. It evolved into an act of historical justice, giving voice to victims who had been silenced for over 170 years. Dr. Sarah Chen's team worked methodically through the mass burial sites, treating each set of remains with the dignity and respect that had been denied to these individuals in life. Every bone, every artifact, every piece of evidence became a testament to lives that had been brutally cut short. The forensic analysis of the remains revealed the full scope of the Colonel's final massacre. 37 complete skeletons were recovered from the main burial site, ranging in age from infants to elderly adults. The positioning of the bodies suggested they had been killed in groups, with families buried together in what appeared to be a systematic execution process. Several of the adult male skeletons showed evidence of restraints, indicating they had been bound before being killed. Among the most heartbreaking discoveries were the remains of children who had been born during the breeding program. DNA analysis confirmed that several of these young victims were the mixed-race offspring of the Colonel's daughters and the enslaved men he had selected for his experiments. These children, who had lived their entire short lives as evidence of their grandfather's crimes, were ultimately murdered to prevent them from serving as witnesses to those same crimes. The personal artifacts found with the remains provided intimate glimpses into the lives of the victims. A small wooden doll clutched in the arms of a child's skeleton, a man's pocket watch engraved with initials that matched plantation records, and a woman's wedding ring that had been passed down through generations of an enslaved family became tangible connections to individual human stories that had been lost to history. Dr. Maria Santos, the geneticist working with the archaeological team, made several significant discoveries through DNA analysis of the remains. She was able to identify family relationships among the victims, confirming that entire families had been murdered together during the Colonel's final purge. More importantly, she was able to connect some of the remains to living descendants in the surrounding communities, providing genetic proof of survival lines that had persisted despite the Colonel's attempts to eliminate all witnesses. The decoding of the Colonel's ledgers and journals provided the most detailed documentation of the breeding program ever discovered. Unlike other historical accounts of plantation slavery that relied on incomplete records or sanitized versions of events, the Colonel's obsessive record-keeping created an unfiltered record of his crimes. Every forced encounter, every birth, every death had been documented with clinical precision, creating a paper trail of systematic human rights violations. Linguistic analysis of the coded portions of the Colonel's journals revealed the extent of his network of collaborators and potential imitators. References to other planters, coded communications about breeding techniques, and discussions of genetic experiments indicated that the Colonel's crimes were part of a broader pattern of scientific racism and sexual violence that extended far beyond his individual plantation. The discovery of medical instruments and pharmaceutical bottles at the site provided evidence of the Colonel's attempts to control reproduction through chemical means. Analysis of residues found in these containers revealed the presence of substances that could induce miscarriage or sterility, indicating that the colonel had used primitive forms of reproductive control to manage the outcomes of his breeding program according to his eugenic theories. Community members descended from the plantation's enslaved population participated in the archaeological process, serving as witnesses to the recovery of their ancestors' remains and providing oral histories that helped contextualize the scientific findings. Elderly residents shared stories that had been passed down through their families, tales of ancestors who had disappeared during the plantation's final days and were never seen again. The integration of scientific evidence with community memory created a more complete picture of the colonel's crimes than either source could have provided alone. The archaeological evidence confirmed the accuracy of oral histories that had been dismissed by earlier historians as unreliable folklore, while the community stories provided human context for the clinical documentation found in the colonel's records. Religious leaders from various denominations participated in ceremonies honoring the victims as their remains were recovered. Father Joseph Martinez, a Catholic priest whose own ancestors had been enslaved on nearby plantations, performed last rites for victims who had been denied proper burial rites over a century and a half earlier. These ceremonies provided spiritual closure for community members while acknowledging the religious dimensions of the historical injustice. The victims' voices, silent for so long, finally found expression through the careful work of scientists, historians, and community members who refused to let their stories remain buried. Each piece of evidence, each scientific analysis, and each community memory contributed to a growing chorus of testimony that demanded recognition, remembrance, and justice for crimes that had been hidden for too long. Chapter 9. Justice Delayed. The completion of the Beauregard plantation excavation in early 2025 marked the end of the archaeological investigation, but it represented only the beginning of a broader reckoning with the historical crimes that had been uncovered. The evidence recovered from the site created legal, ethical, and social challenges that extended far beyond the academic study of plantation history, forcing contemporary society to confront the ongoing legacy of systematic sexual violence and racial exploitation. The forensic evidence gathered during the excavation met the standards required for criminal prosecution, leading legal scholars to debate whether historical crimes of this magnitude could or should be pursued through contemporary justice systems. While the primary perpetrators had been dead for over a century, questions arose about institutional responsibility, descendants' liability, and the broader legal implications of uncovering documented evidence of crimes against humanity. The DNA analysis conducted on the remains provided unexpected connections to modern communities throughout Louisiana and beyond. Dr. Santos's genetic research identified dozens of living individuals who were descended from survivors of the colonel's breeding program, creating both opportunities for historical healing and complex questions about identity, family history, and inherited trauma. Many of these descendants had grown up with family stories about mysterious ancestors, but had never understood the full context of those narratives. Legal advocates working with descendant communities filed lawsuits seeking recognition and compensation for historical injustices, citing the documented evidence of systematic sexual violence and murder as grounds for contemporary legal action. These cases challenge traditional concepts of statute of limitations and legal standing, arguing that crimes against humanity have no expiration date, and that contemporary institutions bear responsibility for historical injustices that were covered up or ignored. The Catholic Church faced particular scrutiny due to evidence that local priests had knowledge of the colonel's crimes but failed to report them or intervene on behalf of victims. Church officials were forced to acknowledge institutional failures and began developing protocols for addressing historical cases where religious authorities had failed to protect vulnerable populations from systematic abuse. Educational institutions throughout Louisiana began incorporating the Beauregard case into curricula about plantation history, using the documented evidence to challenge romanticized narratives about antebellum society and highlight the systematic nature of slavery's cruelties. The case became a powerful tool for teaching about the intersection of sexual violence, racial ideology, and institutional complicity in historical crimes. The discovery also prompted renewed investigation into other plantation sites where similar crimes might have occurred. Historians and archaeologists began applying lessons learned from the Beauregard excavation to examine other locations where documentary evidence suggested systematic sexual violence or unusual mortality patterns among enslaved populations. Mental health professionals working with descendant communities developed specialized treatment protocols for addressing inherited trauma related to sexual violence and historical crimes. The Beauregard case highlighted the ways in which traumatic experiences can affect generations of families, even when the original crimes have been forgotten or suppressed. The international human rights community cited the Beauregard case as an example of the importance of historical accountability and the need for comprehensive investigations into systematic human rights violations, regardless of when they occurred. The case contributed to growing global efforts to document and address historical crimes against vulnerable populations. Museums and historical societies began developing exhibits and educational programs based on the Beauregard evidence, creating opportunities for public education about the realities of slavery while honoring the memory of victims whose stories had been suppressed for over a century. These institutions faced challenges in presenting disturbing historical material in ways that were both educational and respectful to descendant communities. As 2025 progressed, the Beauregard plantation site was transformed into a memorial park where visitors could learn about the crimes that had occurred there while paying respects to the victims whose remains had been recovered. The memorial included individual markers for each identified victim, a museum documenting the breeding program and massacre, and spaces for reflection and remembrance. The ongoing legal, social, and educational responses to the Beauregard discoveries demonstrated that historical justice, while delayed, was not impossible. The voices that had been silenced for over 170 years had finally found expression through the careful work of scientists, historians, and community advocates who refused to let these crimes remain buried. The case served as a powerful reminder that the pursuit of truth and accountability knows no statute of limitations, and that society has an ongoing obligation to confront uncomfortable histories in service of justice and healing. Subscribe to the channel to discover more forbidden and forgotten stories. Thank you for following the case of the Beauregard plantation. We'll see you in the next video.